Hi, and thanks for joining us today for It Seemed Like a Good Idea at the Time, our session where we talk about some of the lessons we've learned the hard way in working with Veeam's products and the rest of your infrastructure. My name is Jim Jones. I'm a senior cloud architect for OffsiteDataSync.
Hey there, my name is Matt Crape. I'm a technical account manager with VMware. Prior to that, I was a longtime Veeam customer as well as a Veeam user group leader. So throughout that time, we've been able to come up with lots of tips and tricks that we're looking forward to sharing.
Howdy y'all, I'm Joe Houghes, currently solutions architect focused on automation and integration with Veeam software and a longtime Veeam user before coming on board. So filling out the roster and we will get us started for what we're discussing here today. So on the agenda, we've got a couple of topics to dig into. We've got some quick tips and tricks. We've got a section where we're going to be thinking a little bit about our storage environment. We're going to discuss adhering to best practices. We've got a fun little section here for stop shooting yourself in the foot, where we're going to dig in a little bit more on things that you absolutely should be doing within your environment. And then we'll wrap things up with some closing thoughts. So starting off for quick tips here. Jim, why don't you get us rolling?
Yeah. So, in the history of working with Veeam software, and I've been doing this quite a while, a lot of people that are especially newer to the product seem to think that it just works. In fact, for a while, Veeam actually used that as a slogan. The reality of it is, unless you're a very small organization, going into the installer and just hitting next, typically isn't going to just work. You'll run into performance and performance and space issues very quickly, especially with things like SQL Server Express, which is what's baked in. For any decently sized environment, you're going to want to look to do more things like scaling out your proxies and repositories to give you greater storage and greater hooks from the Veeam infrastructure into your virtualization. You might be looking at things like DR sites or cloud providers or even cloud tier to allow you to get those backups into compliance with 3-2-1 rule and offsite as well. But with all those things and the want to, as we scale out and make it better, we also really don't want to overthink it. More times than I probably can count, I've seen situations where, let's say from the example in the slide, you've got an organization with maybe 10 or 20 virtual machines and they have 2 proxy servers and 7 repositories, or one of my favorites, even a workstation with a bunch of USB drives hooked up to it, where they've not, really thought through the entire process and things are shooting all over the place. These are things that we really do want to avoid, and we want to always skew towards keeping it simple at every turn that we can. Next coming up, we have Joe talking about some things as well.
Sure. So for the next section, let's go ahead and dig in and let's start with RTFM. So believe it or not, that F really does stand for friendly. Right? The first part of this tip is about just that making sure that you should learn where the docs are that you can find for all the Veeam products, as we really have a great set of documentation. Sure. So these docs will explain how the product works with both descriptions and some visual breakdowns of some of these components, along with showing you how to actually configure the product through the GUI. So understanding the how and the why of any software product really is going to lead you to much more success with architecting, deploying, and using it over its life cycle. And when you need more in-depth explanations of how Veeam components work and interact, this is when you're going to find some of these answers within the best practices guide, right? You're going to go into this guide that's been created and curated by some of Veeam's best engineers and architects over the years. It has really valuable explanations, which will help you understand why we make certain recommendations about how to best utilize Veeam. Also, make note of how we begin the guide with covering how to contact support, as they can greatly assist you if you need it. And we also cover DNS resolution, since as we all know and have read the haiku, it's always DNS. The next thing I want to cover a little bit is avoiding bulk backups, right? Any backup is better than no backup, but what I'm trying to talk about here is containing all of your backups within one large CYA or bucket style backup. If you look at this, where I'm putting individual VMs into a backup job that's not utilizing per VM backups for a repository, all I have is this one gigantic container of full and incremental files where I don't know necessarily what's inside this backup. I don't know all of the machines that exist on all of these restore points. Driving this in this way also means you have a larger blast radius should something happen and you face corruption or somebody accidentally or intentionally deleting one of these backup files. Even if it's an incremental somewhere inside of your chain, you know, the potential data loss is rather large if you're just using these larger bucket style backups. When you start breaking things down a little bit more, especially if you're able to utilize our per VM backup option for your chains on repositories, then it's a lot easier to identify what's inside of these machines because you can actually see a backup chain that relates to an individual VM rather than just one per job. Again, this also decreases your blast radius. You know, if there's an issue with one of these incremental points somewhere in your chain, it's only the chain for an individual VM that's affected. The same thing with this as well. When you're getting to the point of getting away from larger scale, just catch-all buckets for backups, you're driving them more towards policy-based and properly leveraging our application-aware processing. And it's going to get you to where you can actually get better restores out of some of these methods that Matt's going to cover for us in a little while. So Matt, take it away.
Thanks, Joe. So quite often we hear the term, data is the new oil, right? And what that means is data inherently has value, right? And there's many different takes on what that means. But ultimately, it's important to understand that your data does have value, right? Whether it's value to the organization and what it could do, whether it's value and what it holds inside of it. So understanding that it has value, what you want to do with that is you want to make sure that you're leveraging that value. So, this screenshot here, there's a great example of, doing a granular SQL Server restore, being able to know that, yes, you've got a backup of your SQL Server, but also knowing what can you do with that backup, right? You're able to drill down there and, restore some very specific objects. Another example would be Active Directory. As you'll see in this other screenshot here, you're able to do some fairly granular restores with Active Directory. Knowing what you can do with these restores, things like, hey, you could not only restore an object, you can also restore an object's password. Where something like that might be super useful is, say, for example, you accidentally delete, a CEO's Active Directory account. Whoops, okay. Traditionally, you might be able to just create a new account with the same login information, add it to the same groups, be quicker than doing any sort of authoritative restore. But what you'd be missing is things like, okay, what was his password? Without his password, his email's not going to work, right? It's not going to be syncing to Exchange. So being able to do a restore, knowing that you could do a restore where you're able to just yank out the object and its password is fantastic. It might be something like you accidentally delete a computer account. Same thing. You might not be able to actually rejoin it to the domain because it might be remote. So the point that I'm driving at is understanding, what you could do with this data that you backed up, and particularly what Veeam could do with the data that's backed up. I also like to always, use the example of, say, a CEO is getting on a plane somewhere and their laptop is pooched. They call me and say, hey, you know what? I need to get up and running by the time I get off this plane. Now, mind you, nobody's really flying these days, but we'll say it's in the before times. Doing stuff like taking a Veeam agent for Windows backup and restoring that to, let's say, a VMware Horizon desktop, right? That'll get the machine back up and running. At the same time, when the CEO lands, you can just tell them, hey, you know what, go buy a cheap Chromebook, point to our Horizon server, and you'll see your backup. You'll see your laptop in there. Lastly, in this screenshot here, it may not be all that intuitive, but take a look at it. You'll see things such as there's SQL servers in here, there's domain controllers. Let's assume there's some Exchange servers. To Joe's point, you might have a sort of catch-all backup job, which is fine. Some backups better than no backup. But consider, what you're doing with this. Are you sending it off-site? If you're a smaller business, you might be sending it home with someone daily, weekly, something like that. Make sure this person understands what they have in their hands, right? It's not even just a matter of, if this data is stolen, what can someone do with it? It's also a matter of making sure that they treat it right. Are they just taking a hard drive or a tape and tossing it into the car and, not giving any second thought to it? This thing is essentially your insurance policy. So you need to make sure that it's treated well and it's respected. Similarly, there can be a cost associated with this data as well. I'm not just talking about, the media that stores the data. You have to go out buy tapes or hard drives. I'm also saying keep in mind what the data is when it comes to restores. We've got things like GDPR compliance or PCI if you're in finance. knowing where you can restore this data is a big component of it as well. Consider things like data sovereignty, right? Veeam has tools built into it so that you can ensure that when you're storing data, you're storing it to a zone where it's safe to do so. And keep that in mind as well when you're restoring data, that the data that you are restoring should be restorable, if that makes sense. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Joe, and he's going to touch on storage a bit.
Sure. So we'll get into a discussion on storage here. And a lot of this really comes down to just one of the most critical components for your backups, right? As Matt said, this is your insurance policy. So you've got to think about this storage being, your backup files that you're going to keep around long term. And there's some good and bad things with that you've got to take into consideration as you're planning out an environment. So this one is kind of NEFS, right? Choose your own adventure. On the left side of the slide here, really the point that I'm trying to get into is you want to avoid additional or unnecessary abstractions, right? In the end, with Veeam particularly, you really want to try and keep everything with direct access to the backup storage. If you have a virtual environment and you have a Veeam backup server and specifically a backup repository living inside of that environment, you really don't want to be writing to that VMFS file system, because if there's an outage, if there's some sort of a problem, if you can't get your virtual environment backup, that means you also can't access the Veeam backup files that live in that VMFS layer, right? So with that extra layer of abstraction there, you can't necessarily easily get to your backups the same way that you could, where I know everybody in the VMware space is going to hate me for saying this. If you were on an RDM, you could attach any box to that and bring it back up because Windows knows what to do with that direct line. I'm not advocating for RDMs, but to make that point and to get some people to pay attention, occasionally I'll bring that up in conversations to just say, removing that abstraction sometimes is very critical. On the right side of the page here, what we're looking at a little bit is some of the new options that we have within Veeam, right? There's a lot of folks that have been using REFS for the past couple of years and took it as a very large upgrade or very good performant upgrade from NTFS. But there's some trade-offs here, right? So for anyone that's still using NTFS, and particularly if you're trying to use this for Windows deduplication, right, we want to make sure that you're formatting this NTFS with the /L parameter, right, for the large size file record segment. And then you also want to be sure that you're using the 64K allocation unit size. That same 64K allocation unit is going to translate over for REFS as well. But honestly, there's some caveats. There's some gotchas that you need to be aware of with these things. Windows is still making improvements to REFS. Even in 2016, they got it fairly solid and then had a couple of hiccups in 2019. Some of these are just things to be aware of. When you dig into the bottom of the page, we got a screenshot up here just looking at some differences in performance from ext4 looking up to XFS, which Veeam is now supporting. And even with XFS is great. It gives us a lot of great performance benefits. There's even the tax of a Windows server that's taken out of the mix a little bit. But there can be potential issues with, say, fragmentation and things like that. And also just be aware of the fact that these improvements are being made outside of Veeam to these file systems. So you may end up in a situation where Veeam support will do as much as we can, to assist with you, but we may run into potential issues that are something that's an additional layer of that storage in the file system that you have chosen to use inside of your environment that gets outside of the realm of something that's totally under Veeam control for what we're aware of. In these instances, you can't always go to the Veeam forum or to Veeam support, and we've got some great guys that are ready to give recommendations for this. But for some of these things, you really are choosing your own adventure in which path you're going down to try and get the best performance and the best long-term results out of this investment that you've made inside of your environment. And you also need to be aware of the fact that with both REFS and XFS, if you do have to migrate the storage, you will lose the block cloning or any of the space savings that you've had from doing essentially zero space synthetic pulls inside of your environment. So just something else to be aware of. And in the end, we just say friends don't let friends be MDK. So Matt, why don't you give us a little rundown on this?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So storage is one of the most important components of most infrastructures. Take vSphere for example. You can have high-end servers, loads of CPU, loads of RAM, but if the storage isn't reliable, you're just going to be in for a bad day, right? It's the heart of any solution, and that holds true for a lot of backup systems as well. Ultimately, we need to be writing some sort of backup media, whether it be hard drives, tape, cloud. There's some sort of media at the end that we're writing to. And you want to make sure that that's sized properly. So anyone who's taken the VMCE exam has likely seen this image up here before, where it sort of highlights the different backup methods as well as the number of IOs required or associated with it. I always like to pick on reverse incremental backups. When they first came out, they were, fairly well used. I know I myself used them. Quite a few folks in my Veeam user group at the time used them. But performance was horrible on them, right? So the draw to them was, hey, you know what? The latest file is always going to be the full backup. If I need to restore from 3 days ago, whatever, I've got 3 incrementals I need to read from. But there's an appeal of basically always having the newest file being first. The downside is, there's a lot of I/O involved. I remember specifically I had some, it was a decent SAN at the time, but it would just absolutely crawl when it came to reverse incrementals. So the point that I'm getting at here is understand what these different I/O requirements are per job and figure out what job makes the most sense to you and why. Forward incrementals tend to be the default now, and there's a reason for that. They have some of the lowest overhead, and frankly, they get the job done and they get it done well. So it's not just a matter of even when you're writing these backups, also consider restore times, right? So that's kind of where reverse incremental did have that little bit of appeal, but at the end of the day, generally speaking, you're probably not going to want to go down that road. The other thing I want to touch on is production versus backup storage. And that could mean a few things. So as Joe alluded to, don't back up within VMDKs. But to take that even a step further, let's say you're building out a new Veeam environment and you're putting your VBR server in the VM. Default first repository is, basically on the C drive of the Veeam server. It's not unheard of for people to just start backing up right away. That touches on Jim's point as well. You can't just say next, finish, right? You do need to apply some configuration. You want to make sure you're running best practice. Because under this sort of default install, you would find that your backups are being written to the same VM that's sitting on your production storage. So not only is your backup now encapsulated in this VMDK file, it's sitting on your production storage. What happens if you have your SAN fail and you're out of your backups? But it's not even just that. Occasionally folks might set up an iSCSI one, or maybe even just an NFS file share and write their backups to that as well. So be very mindful of where your backups are physically being stored. Make sure it's not on the same storage as your production. Additionally, take a look at secondary storage versus backup appliances. And this could be a whole other topic, right? You might just say, I've got a physical server somewhere with just a bunch of disk in there. Hey, good on you, right? If it's doing the performance that you need, you're getting the IOPS that you need, the hardware's good enough that you're sure that it's going to be protected, great. You might look at, some vendors do have what they call secondary storage devices. They might have various offerings and benefits. Take a look at those. Additionally, there's, dedicated backup appliances. There's lots of Veeam partners that offers those. At the end of the day, make sure that you understand, what the trade-offs are with these. Sure, you might get, fantastic compression ratios, but what happens when it comes time to restore? What's a rehydration time look like? So a lot of them have, limits to the number of items they have in the backup chain. How does that impact your backup jobs? Especially if you're doing things like, grandfather, father, son, backup copies. Or even long-term performance. It's not uncommon for organizations to need to hold on to data for 3, 5, 7, 10, maybe forever, right? That's the number of years, that is. What will that do? Will performance drop off drastically after you hit, 80% capacity? Where's that fit in your timeline? Are you going to hit 80% capacity in 3 years? Does that mean everything after that is just, poor? So make sure you understand where your bottleneck is as well. So we're talking about storage. Storage is probably one of the most common bottlenecks, but it's not the only bottleneck. You might have a severely under-provisioned VBR server. That can absolutely affect how quickly things are being processed. Maybe your backup proxy is undersized, or maybe it's sized right, but you know what? You've only got 2 concurrent jobs going on there as a maximum. Make sure that you take a look at your architecture as a whole. Make sure that you sort of assess, hey, what sort of performance can I get out of my storage? And if you still find that you're having problems and you've ruled out storage, make sure you check the rest of the infrastructure. So with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Joe.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, this is a very important topic that a lot of people miss sometimes. A lot of people are aware of the restore point simulator that was produced by one of the excellent systems engineers, Timothy DeWin, over in the EMEA Veeam offices. But a lot of people just think that storage for their backup environment is just the raw capacity that they need for it. They don't take into account some of the other overhead, like you were mentioning, task limitations or resources on proxies. So this is a snapshot out of our install guide for the requirements for a backup repository server. And as you'll see here, we specifically call out, a hardware requirement for CPU and memory. There's going to be a limitation of essentially, how many tasks you can handle based on what you have for resources that are allocated to this environment. And depending on the size of the machines, the total number of disks that you're going to have, the size of the chain for a backup, how many VMs are within the backup. Right, this is going to drive more and more need for additional resources on the servers that are acting as proxies and as repositories, and even on your network inside of this environment. And as you throw additional things in the mix, if you're starting to use deduplication, if you're starting to use dedicated deduplication appliances, right, this is going to drive some different changes and some additional or at least different requirements within your environment. And to take a snapshot out of our best practices guide again here, you'll see that we've actually got a little bit different information depending on the method that you're using for running these backup chains. If you're using per job backup files as opposed to per VM backup files, we have a different recommendation for what you're going to need to calculate the resources that are required. But we do have minimums that we really, really, really want to ensure that you meet this requirement for what the base needs to be, regardless of what the right method is. If you're not using reverse incrementals, which most people are not anymore, if you're not sticking with forever forwards, and if you're using just forward with synthetic and active fulls inside of the environment, there's still going to be a base limitation, even though that I/O requirement on the storage itself is going to be lessened. And then here, to really drive the point home, we've got some details as far as just what it is we want you to be aware of and be considering when it comes to resiliency of your repository, right? You need to consider that this is hosting an essential copy of your data. If you have something that goes wrong in production, this is how you recover your environment. This also needs to be scalable, right? You need to be able to grow this requirement for the storage and the resources to drive that storage as your data growth gets larger and larger, or potentially as your retention gets longer and longer. So you just need to be thinking about the things about also having high performance in case you have the need to do instant restores. But you also need to have a repository that has additional capacity, even if you end up tiering off to cheaper, slower storage, or if you just go super cheap and deep off with putting things out to S3 or to the cloud. You just need to be planning all of these things for what it is you're going to do with these retention points and how you're going to actively manage them, from your quicker early on backups to the kind of longer in the tooth backup chains where you just need to keep these for archival purposes. But as we get into expanding these needs for storage, Jim can give us some really good pointers here.
Yeah, Joe. So yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the mention of getting things out to the cloud. So not only because I work for a Veeam certified service provider, I've always had a bit of a passion about how we get those backups offsite. And now in version 10, we have the new capability to use copy mode, which allows us let's take a step back and think about the differentiators for a second. So with copy mode, when we do our backups, we are going to leverage a server that has an on-premises repository and then an S3 compatible Azure Blob. Pick your hyperscaler flavor out there in the same repository, and we're literally going to tee the backup and send it to both locations at once. Alternatively, with your traditional backup copy jobs and using Cloud Connect providers, we have immediate mode now, which lets us get a lot of the same features and functionalities where we can now map directly to a backup job, and that just automatically begins copying as soon as the on-prem backup is done. But to me, one of the true differentiators, and one of those things that we as administrators have to really think out, is not just the backup, but really what's going to happen when it comes time to do those restores. Working for OffsiteDataSync, one of the things that we see more often than not is that there is often needs for lights out style restores, whether it be, it's not just catastrophic. It can be anything from an extended power outage to flooding or any other number of things. And as we think about copy mode, and especially in terms of your smaller and medium-sized businesses that maybe don't have, frankly, cloud architects on staff that are used to working with AWS or Azure or any of these other companies, there's a lot of logistics that go into what you have to do to replicate your infrastructure in this completely and totally different platform. AWS is not vSphere and Azure is not Hyper-V, and it's a completely different architecture that has to be thought out, tested, and so that when that moment of whatever happens and you need to get up and running as fast as possible, you know how to do it. Alternatively, most of your major VCSPs that are out there have the capability to have what we call typically DRaaS, so DR as a service, or we have infrastructure as a service resources that are available to you, and often they match what the platform that you're coming from. So if you're running vSphere, we have vCloud Director resources available. If you run Hyper-V, we have that as well, and we can, especially in those situations where you need to get a server or all your servers, up and running, we can be that, helping hand or, guiding force that helps you go from, oh crap, everything's down, to, okay, we can get this back up and here's the stages that we need to get this going. And so with that, I'd like to throw to Joe for our next section.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jim. And I've got to say, from personal experience, during a recovery is not the time to learn cloud. And recovering to cloud is entirely different than operating in cloud, which is something that a lot of folks don't necessarily think of. So for the next section here, we're gonna discuss a little bit more of adhering to these best practices that we have. Right, we're gonna dig in a little bit to some of the best practices that we want everybody to take to heart and make sure that you really comprehend, understand what these things are meant to be, and that you really design your environment to meet these. So one of the favorite topics that we have for most folks is, who do you trust, right? So this image here is based off of, everyone's old MC2C 2000 or 2003 training that I'm sure most of us that have been in IT forever took back in the day to understand domain trusts. And really what it is that I'm trying to get at here is understanding that within your environment, you should have segregation from your production environment to your backup environment. A lot of folks will automatically take that to mean that you must be running work groups for your Veeam environment. And that's not at all what I mean by this. Typically what I try and recommend to folks is actually having a trusted or a management domain that's working within your environment, that is where most of your architects and engineers are operating from the majority of the time, as opposed to your production environment. This is gonna consist of everything from your backups to your server management, sometimes to your patching, all sorts of things that need to be controlling or accessing your production environment, but shouldn't necessarily be one and the same, right? We don't want to be mixing these two environments. And another shot that we pulled out of one of the guides that one of the systems engineers put together as far as hardening the Veeam environment, this is the kind of thing that we're looking at here, right? You really want to consider having management zones and trusted zones, or at least, a DMZ and a restricted zone for your environment, where not everything inside of your organization's environment should be just directly accessible on the internet, and not all of these should be commingled together. And then you might even have something similar to this where you have an audit zone off to the side where you're doing monitoring and analytics that are outside of your production environment. Not only does that mean that these things are potentially not consuming the same resources as your production environment, your management and your audit zone may be one and the same on some segregated servers, so they're not impacting your production when they're running all of their functions. But this should also be, something to keep in mind as far as restrictions of who can access things and what things should have, I guess, a greater level of visibility into who is doing what inside of your environment. And then, to really drive it home, some of the things that we have documented for Veeam that we really want to make sure that people understand is, as it relates to your backups and replicas, it's, ensuring the very basic things like physical security of target servers. For a lot of organizations, this is going to be you having your environment in a dedicated data center or colos, right? So most of the times the physical security is just something that's kind of, a level set for everyone that already kind of exists. But consider doing things like restricting your user access to backups and replicas. Who actually needs to have access to this data? Sometimes it's even putting security counts in place, right? So security or service accounts that have dedicated access to do these functions and to access this data, and not everyone's user account specifically, right? Typically, the operation needs to happen. It doesn't need to actually be the operator that is the one doing that by name. So think about those extra steps and kind of the extra level of segregation there, just to ensure that these things are controlled and maintained the way that they should be. One of the easiest ways to avoid having a ransomware infection inside of your environment is to ensure that you're not accessing everything with domain administrator credentials. Isolate your backup traffic, encrypt your network traffic. These things are not necessarily the easiest to actually implement and to put into place, but sometimes these end up being some of the simplest solutions to some of these really overarching problems that can take down someone's environment. And then at the very end here, internet access for backup servers. If you don't actually need just full-blown internet access for everything, read through the documentation and find out what functionality that we have that requires outbound internet access, and lock it down to that, right? You can enable product update checks and the automatic license updates and license usage reporting, but your Veeam backup server should not just have open access to the internet without anyone looking and seeing what's going on. So as we dig into some more of these more critical points, I'm going to hand it over to Jim to discuss some more about encryption.
Yeah, well, it's great to hear you talk about the encrypting of the backup traffic, Joe, which is, absolutely important. And, your mention of, making sure that, everybody has their data sitting in, co-located data centers or whether they have restricted access. Well, that is absolutely best practice from my own personal experience. That doesn't actually happen all the time. As the sirens will tell you, this is a pretty important thing. So we need to talk about what we're going to do with our backups as they're sitting at rest. Amazingly enough, both as being a Vanguard and helping other people work with their backups, and then now in my official role, it's amazing to me how many times we see people that haven't enabled encryption on their backups. This is stunningly important to you and your organization to make sure that you're checking that box literally inside the advanced settings of your target on your backup copy jobs, that data has an encryption and that it has a password that you actually remember what it is and have documented somewhere, so that it's not sitting in that someone else's computer that is the cloud, free and clear to anyone that they want to use. Further, if just as an FYI, just checking that box and setting a password for it isn't going to just get it done. If you are doing this on an existing chain of backups, you have to make sure you run an active full, or else that'll just keep on backing up in perpetuity without ever enabling encryption. In fact, me myself in a previous role did just that. I enabled the encryption when the option became a thing, and a few months later, came to find out the encryption wasn't turned on. Another thing when we talk about getting those backups off site is, in the same place where we enable that encryption in flight, the encrypting the backup traffic as we're sending that somewhere else, we can also do some things with throttling. And for places that especially are lower bandwidth or can't dedicate an entire link just to backup traffic, which is frankly most of us, one of the most important things that we get into is messing with the network traffic rules. One of the things that I always advocate for is you need at least two network traffic rules. You need one that runs in your out of hours window that, give somebody that just happens to be a go-getter and is working late, give them 1 megabit per second that, is not dedicated to bandwidth traffic. So if you have 50 megabit link, set it to 49 megabit. But then, backups sometimes run long, unfortunately. So when that happens, we need a second set of rules that are your in business hours, going to this, from the same source to the same destination, but knock that all the way down to, say, for that 50 megabit link, 20 megabit or 25 megabit, so that you're not impactful on production uses, but your backups can still continue and finish in the background before your next backup window starts. So, this kind of, these are kind of leading into some things where I've done and seen things done and done things maybe poorly in the past and have turned into best practices. For some more of these, I want to go ahead and shoot over to Joe for other ways that maybe we can stop shooting ourselves in the foot in terms of impacting our backup performance.
Sure. So one of the next sections we want to dig into here is, stop shooting yourself in the foot. These are some typically pretty easy practices that you put into your environment to actually get a lot better performance out of even an existing Veeam design, sometimes by just making some fairly simple changes, either in the way that you're managing these things or just operating your environment. So one thing is doing and understanding things better, right? And this is a slide I dig into here, really talking about tagging within a vSphere environment. So if you look at this test job that I have from one of my labs, you'll see that I have 5 machines that are added in here by name, right? Just individual virtual machines that somebody clicked add, dropped in a bunch of VMs, and now they're contained in a backup job. If we take it one step further and we actually leverage vSphere tags, this makes it a lot easier to manage your environment, both from the Veeam side as well as from the vSphere side. This also enables you to essentially have, backups as a subscription model, where someone that knows that a backup needs to be within that a VM needs to be within a particular backup job or needs to be backed up by a specific method, all they've got to do is deal with the tagging inside of the virtual environment. They don't need to know everything about your job construction within Veeam. If you don't have an existing tagging structure for your environment, you can also leverage the business view groups within VeeamON, where you can do multi-value conditions that you can say, in an example like this, all VMs that are powered on, that are running a Linux guest OS, that live in my Atlanta data center, I want these to have a specific tag. And if you allow it, we can actually put this tag back into your vSphere environment and tag all VMs that match this. And in the end, really you just need to kind of understand what's going on here with these different systems that are coordinating with each other. What you see in this screenshot here is within my vCenter environment, I have one particular VM called OffsiteDataSync, and that's what you see inside of the UI in Veeam. So you might think that as this VM moves around, just by it having the same name, that's going to match. But actually what we have, based on this Power CLI that I'm pulling up here, is the MoRef ID, right? This is what we're actually keying off of for the VM, right? It's this particular instance ID, which means this is the, essentially serial number of this VM that I have, that as it moves, and especially as you move from one vCenter to another vCenter, if you're migrating VMs around, this is going to change. This ID will change. If you move, from vCenter 1 to vCenter 2, even if you move back to vCenter 1, you might end up with a different MoRef ID for a particular VM. And this underlying ID that's here, in this instance, it's actually the instance UUID. I didn't pull up the MoRef ID. I'm just trying to make the point here that this underlying identifier for the VM is actually what it is that we're keying off of here. So these are the kinds of things you need to understand. As Veeam 9.5 Update 4 came out, we had this addition of this broker service here. So before, Veeam would reach out and connect to your vCenter server every time it had to do updates of your inventory. Now we have this broker service acting as an interim, where basically you can do quicker lookups. We keep this information in memory and in the cache, but it's another layer of obfuscation that's here, where you just have to understand how these components work, at least enough to understand that just because you see something on the screen, that's not necessarily what's actually going on behind the scenes. So to dig into tags a little bit more, I'll hand it over to Matt.
Thanks, Joe. So yeah, Joe, you gave a great overview of tags. I'm just going to dive into that a little bit deeper here. I've been a huge fan of using vSphere tags for pretty much as long as I've known about them. And the real beauty around them is you're able to create jobs and almost policies in that regard without needing to worry about the sort of day-to-day maintenance. I know something that I fell victim to in the past, and many others have, is a new VM, maybe a group of VMs, an application get rolled out to your vSphere server, but you may forget to add them to the backup job. If you're not using tags, if you're actually going in there and specifying VMs, you might forget to put them in. Similarly, if you're doing things at the data store level, or maybe at folder level, or maybe you're getting crazy and going at the cluster level, just backing everything up in one job, there could be a lot of waste in there. You may not need to back up, that web server every day, especially if it's configured on a database server. That should be backed up every day. So, to make things simple, if you're not familiar with vSphere tags, you create a category for the tag, and you assign tags to that category. So in the example here, you got weekly, daily, monthly. Then within Veeam, you could just say, hey, make a new job, click on the little tag icon. By default, it's not that, it's VMs. But click on the tag icon, choose a tag, so you can go through and basically build out the rest of the job normal way, figure out schedules, all that sort of stuff. And what's handy is you basically make tags, or rather jobs, based off of, hey, I want all my domain controllers in this one, so you just tag them as DCs. I want all my SQL servers in one. tag them as SQL. It's extremely easy to get up and running. A little bit of a shameless plug. I wrote a fairly simple script that will dump existing tags from your vCenter, pop them into an Excel spreadsheet, and then it just ingests that based off of how you tag them daily, weekly, monthly, and it creates jobs for you. So there's really no reason why you can't do that. So with that, I think we're good. Oh yes, and sorry, apologies here. As I was mentioning, sort of grouping jobs together, they're very ideal for, let's say, SQL, where you need to go in and you need to add some additional settings within the job itself. Say you want to truncate the logs, or maybe you might want to have multiple SQL jobs, one where the logs are truncated like this, another one where they're backed up periodically every 15, 30 minutes. It really gives you the granularity to go in there and add your workloads to a job that really fits the bill for you. So with that, I'm going to pass it along to Jim.
Yep. So one last thing to cover before we start wrapping up for this session is, there's lots of things that unfortunately we do to ourselves to actually slow down our own backups. And it seems like something that we're doing right, but it's amazing what happens when you kind of think it all out. The biggest one of these for me is the concept of WAN accelerators. So it's a WAN accelerator, right? I should be able to turn that on and poof, my backups are much, much faster than they were. That is true up to 50 megabit per second. And as we now with version 10 and the high bandwidth mode of WAN accelerator for 100 megabit and over. But if you're in that 50 to 100 megabit ground, and actually as you approach the 50 point, one thing that I've found myself is that enabling WAN acceleration will actually slow your backups down. The cache fills up faster than, the cache never really gets a hit because it's going straight out the link, or it gets overrun depending on which side of that, that number that you're sitting at. So be cognizant, read the documentation at helpcenter.veeam.com on WAN acceleration and when to use it and when not to would be a big thing to look at. Another thing that I often see that slow down people's backups on premises is figuring out the placement and how to scale their proxies and repositories. Often I'll see a situation where a company has 20 different virtualization hosts. They have 5 different repositories, and they're still using just the default proxy that was set up on their Veeam backup and replication server with like 2 cores assigned to it or something like that. So you've got this gigantic bottleneck in the middle of your backup system because you're only processing 2 virtual machines at once. Especially in an environment that's using vSAN, the guidance is to have 1 proxy per host that you have participating in the vSAN cluster, so that it's handling all its own traffic and getting it out to the repositories in a timely and efficient manner. But one thing is, for any size environment, when you're performing your backups and you're actually watching the statistics of it, or after the backups happen and you look at the statistics window, there is actually a thing that tells you in there where your bottleneck is. Now, your backups may be absolutely flying, but it will still show you the thing that is the slowest of all your components. And if your backups are slow, that's a great place to start to look at how can I make these more performant. And finally, the last thing to understand is, as we talk about backups that are using VMware networking, the VM kernel port is purposely by VMware throttled down to only be allowed to use 40% of its available bandwidth. So if you have backup traffic flowing through one of these virtualized NICs, it's never going to be as fast and performant as if you're backing up directly to, say, a hardware NIC. And with that, I'm going to hand off one more time to my good friend Joe to give us a little bit of ideas of some next steps that you can take.
Thank you all for coming out for our presentation. Thanks to Jim and Matt for sharing some time with us and some great tips. Most of these have been hard learned by all of us through our careers of quite a few different Veeam environments. So next things for everyone to look into when they're here on this webinar with us, go dig into Veeam University. We've got a lot of outstanding free training that's out there for everyone, a lot of good video courses. Dig into the Veeam white papers. We have things that are in that environment, in that menu that don't relate to Veeam entirely. Lots of things about Windows, lots of things about other best practices, lots of things about some fantastic scripting, which you'll find. Technical documentation, as I mentioned earlier on in the presentation, everybody should know and love the docs from Help Center. This is just a great resource for you to have to understand the what and the why of all things within Veeam. Obviously, you can follow Veeam and connect with any of us, through Twitter, LinkedIn. Veeam's got, fantastic videos on YouTube if anyone needs an additional resource. There's plenty of other webinars and seminars going on with VeeamON right now. If anybody wants to figure out how specifically they find that bottleneck within their environment, shameless plug, you can come join me in one of my PowerShell sessions and I'll show you where to find that. And again, thanks to everyone for coming out and hanging out with us for this presentation.
Thank you, everyone.
Adios.
Thanks.